Hey everybody, it's been a while since I've done a webinar. I think this is my first one for 2022. So Happy New Year to those of you that I haven't seen in a while. And I'm excited to bring you kind of a good overview, foundational piece today that if you've listened to our content before, well, some of it will sound familiar, but maybe it will be just a good high-level review as everybody is kind of planning for 2022 and executing strategies throughout the year. So I'm going to start with a very foundational concept, and then we're going to talk about 5 areas that we see as kind of the key development health kind of checklist. And as Lacey said, you're going to get a piece, a download later that'll help you kind of summarize that. But foundationally, I want to start with this idea of who is your customer. We love to teach this concept because I think it rings true with people who understand the for-profit world and how we serve customers. In the nonprofit world, there's typically 2 distinct customers. So if you think about the for-profit world, the analogy I like to use is if I had a sandwich shop, I'm a Subway fan, and if I was a Subway franchise owner, I know who my customer is, and my customer buys my sandwiches and they consume my sandwiches. And so I know how to serve that customer. In the nonprofit space, most organizations have some distinction between those they serve and those who fund the mission. Now, some organizations have overlap depending on your mission, but I know many of those, especially in the human service space, which a lot of you are, there's a big distinction here. So those who benefit from your mission and those who fund your mission are typically not the same. And so we in development like to think about those who fund our mission as an equally important customer, just like those we serve. And the role of development is really to serve this second customer. And if you're in development full time, you know that this is who you probably wake up thinking about every day is your donor base and those who are funding your primary mission. And so that's the way we like to frame it, is that is the role of development, serving this other customer. So the role of development is to serve that customer, and the participation of that customer base is absolutely critical. So ultimately, this is just a concept that we believe leaders in the nonprofit space, including your board, should understand and embrace, so that development has this very sort of equal importance in terms of planning and strategy. And it's not just, hey, let's hit this target next year because we need to raise more money, but there's really planning and strategy that goes behind it. Okay, so I'm going to dive into these 5 elements that we kind of see as the framework for a healthy fundraising plan. So the first one we're going to talk about is events. And it's kind of ironic that we're talking about this today. If you're watching this webinar in a recording later, we're recording this on March 16th, 2022, which I think of as sort of D-Day from 2020. This was Monday in 2020 when we all kind of came back from maybe spring break or the prior week and everything was shutting down. And I remember taking lots of phone calls that day and the days to follow around events. And here we are 2 years later, and lots of events are back, or at least in the planning stages. So it's a really good time to revisit this idea of healthy events if they are a part of your fundraising strategy. So what's wrong with events? Can events be done really well? Yes. But we like to say that events can be really done wrong if they're done in a vacuum. So you're going to hear us talk a lot today about aligned strategies and a development plan that really one strategy feeds another strategy. And events can be very effective when they're done as a part of a bigger strategy. But when they're done just in a vacuum as a moment to raise some money, they can be very challenging for your development department and not effective at all. So let's talk about the good in events, because there are some positive things that come out of them. There is a lot of camaraderie, networking. It's a lot of fun to have donors get together. You can engage volunteers this way, and you can definitely raise some money. But many times the money raised is done at an extreme cost, both financially and time. And so evaluating the amount of time and expense that goes into it is a critical measurement for an organization to take as they are planning and executing. So the bad that can happen in events, one of my least favorite thing about events is when they disguise your mission. And what I mean by that is that an attendee could come to your event and leave there without understanding what you do as an organization. And so if you don't have a good platform to introduce your mission or share in a compelling way the story of what you do as an organization, I would question whether that's an effective event. If you spend money and time getting people in a room, at a minimum, you want them to leave there with a better understanding of what you do, who you serve, the impact that you make. So making sure that there's a good mission moment and a way for people to engage is a critical element. They can create a silo in your development team or your plan because there's a group or a person that is super focused on that event being successful, perhaps to the detriment of the donor. A lot of attention goes away from other things. And usually I see this in shops all the time, where the entire team may get wrapped up in event planning or post-event, auction basket delivery and things like that for several days, pre and post event. So it diverts a lot of attention from staff. Many times, the financial payoff is not as significant as perhaps it should be for the amount of time invested. And they're, of course, vulnerable to conflicts or crazy times, as we've been through over the last couple of years. So events are an important part of a development plan when they're done strategically as part of a broader strategy. But making sure that we kind of avoid these challenges is critical to the health of the development operation and, quite frankly, the sanity of your team. So how can these events be successful and strategic? So first of all, events are a great way to start relationships. And to me, this is probably the most valuable part of an event, getting people that you want to know better into a room to learn about your mission. And whether they give at the event or not, if you are able to start a relationship or further a relationship because that event brought them in front of you, that's a wonderful outcome that you can achieve. So reducing the expectation then of the financial outcome is a way to help your event become more strategic. Again, it's more about who we connect with, who we get in the room, the story that we're able to tell, and what we're able to do as a result of the event. And we're not just pushing that the dollars that day or that night are the only important metric that we're measuring. So we're going to measure other strategic objectives, whether it's new people, donors we want to know better, specific other things other than the financial outcomes, and we're going to make them mission centric. So back to my comment a minute ago about, do you have a platform? Do you have a platform to tell your story? Is it compelling? Do people leave there knowing more about you than they did when they walked in? And then most importantly is a plan to transition event donors to other strategies. So we're going to talk more about those aligned strategies. But if you only time you ever interact with them or see them is at events, there's probably a missed opportunity to engage them in different ways, hopefully deeper into your mission outside of just the event venue. So thinking about this ahead of time and making sure there's a very intentional plan to connect with event donors after the event and introduce them to other areas of your organization. It's a really important strategic move for an event. We like to recommend no more than 2 significant annual events, unless you're a very large organization. And if you've got a large staff and you've got a full event menu and a full events team, that may be different. But for most of our clients, in the size and scope of the budgets that we typically work with, 2 events a year is about the right balance in terms of staff time and capacity. Okay, so that's healthy events and thinking about how they play into your full development plan. The second then is just to be looking at your development operation from a completely alignment point of view. So the question is, what are you honestly trying to accomplish within your development plan? And obviously it's more than just raising X amount of money, but how are we going to do that? What are the strategies that are going to lead us to that sustainable kind of growth that we want? So this is our relationship pyramid. Most development folks are very familiar with this. And we like to use the analogy of personal relationships as a really perfect sort of mirror to what most development operations experience. So if you think about your own life and people that you know in different forms, it probably looks something like this, where at the base of your pyramid, you have a larger number of people that today you might call your social media friends. I used to call this my Christmas card list, but folks that I don't interact with regularly, but I have some very infrequent type of communication or connection with, but certainly not regular or deep. And then as we go up our pyramid, each segment gets smaller, but the relationship gets stronger. So most of us don't have many people in our lives that we see one-on-one on a regular basis. We might have friends that we see in groups, through social circles, neighborhoods, your kids' activities, people that we just interact with because of commonalities. But people that we really spend one-on-one time with, it's probably a small number of people that you could probably count on 2 hands. And then maybe you've got 2 or 3 people that you'd put at the top of the pyramid here as the people you call, when big life events happen. So this relationship pyramid is very natural and normal in our lives. And we know that people move up and down in this pyramid as life happens. So the people who were my acquaintances and group friends 20 years ago certainly look different than they do today, just based on movement and stages of life. So the key here is that it's reciprocal in terms of the energy and time we put into a relationship and the energy and time we get back that moves people kind of up and down a relational pyramid. So the analogy then for a development office, in the same way, most development offices are going to have a database perhaps, or some other larger group of people that you interact with through transactional things like online appeals, direct mail, perhaps even events where they don't know you that well, but they somehow are connected to you on a transactional basis. The goal then is to create these segments of donors that we can strategically move into deeper relationships. So back to the event conversation, if the goal of an event is to meet new people, then it stands to reason that we want a strategy that takes them from that bottom piece of our pyramid up to the next level or 2 or 3 eventually. And the only way we do that is through more personal engagement with them. So the higher they get on the pyramid, the key is the deeper the relationship is. They know you, they pick up the phone and they know who to call in the organization. Ideally, they're anchored with more than one person, but at least there is a personal connection and relationship with your staff and or board. And usually the investment or the philanthropy increases as the engagement increases. So this is the way we like to think about the aligned strategies and how to kind of think about moving donors strategically from one strategy to another. So for an event strategy, as an example, we all think that the goal of an event is that we have prospective donors that come to our events and they leave our events as donors, which is a great outcome. We certainly want that. But the more strategic alignment that we're looking for is that we actually market our events or our campaigns or other activities, that we conduct events and campaigns that get people into our funnel. But then there's a very intentional strategy to promote them, if you will, into what we might call a mid-level donor, which just means that we now have more engagement with them. Maybe their giving increases. And over time, they might become what we would think of as a major donor, which again, usually results in larger gifts, but more importantly, really speaks to the depth of relationship. So this is the strategic flow that we like to look at in the healthy development operation, that all of your strategies are somehow aligned to feed other pieces of your development plan. So that strategic alignment, just to kind of summarize, is using those events or other campaigns really for what they do best, making sure that everything is designed as part of a bigger strategy, and always stay mission focused in what you do. Don't get caught up in gimmicks or fads that disguise your mission, but make sure everything you do is really serving the interests of the donor and bringing them closer to your purpose. And then measuring things that promote growth. And we're going to talk more about that. But we don't want to incentivize our staff in particular to keep donors in a strategy because the staff needs to have a successful event, for an example. So if someone is an event donor, that's wonderful. But if we can take them out of the event model and they will give directly to us, perhaps even larger amounts, then that's okay. That's success, that donor may not sponsor anymore, but now they're contributing to the organization in more meaningful ways. So we want to encourage and promote that kind of activity. Okay, the third piece is your board. And we're going to just touch on this briefly. What should you expect from an engaged board when it comes to the fundraising side of the organization? The best way to describe this is leadership by example. Everybody understands that concept. It's easy to teach to a board. The board should not expect others outside of the organization to do something they aren't willing to do themselves. So whether that's personal philanthropy or other engagement, that's ultimately what we want them to understand. Occasionally we run into a board that will say, well, we're not really a fundraising board. That's not our primary purpose. We have a staff that does that. And our response to that is always, yes, you are. If you are a nonprofit board that relies on philanthropy, part of your fiduciary duty is understanding the fundraising strategy and participating at the right levels. May not mean they're out asking for gifts, but there should be an element of the fundraising strategy that they own and that they execute. So what does that engaged board do, or what should they do? Number one, they should have conviction for your mission. This seems very obvious, but sometimes we allow ourselves to enlist board members who perhaps represent an entity, a company or some other group in the community, and they're sort of there as a representative as opposed to a passionate supporter. That can lead to a lot of other challenges on the board. So we believe that every member of your board should certainly have conviction personally for what you do and truly be outside of their day job, somebody who believes in you and supports you. They should give. I know a lot of organizations have adopted the give or get mentality. We believe every board member should give something of their personal resources. You may not be their highest priority. They may support other organizations, and that's okay. That's a decision for you to make. But for a board member to not give at all philanthropically sends a signal to outside funders that the board is not 100% in. So this is a much larger conversation. I'm happy to go deeper with those of you that may disagree with that, but from our perspective, this is a non-starter. And they still can certainly help get, other resources, and that's great, but that shouldn't substitute for their own personal philanthropy at the appropriate level, even if it's relatively small. They should rank your mission somewhere in their top 5. It's pretty well known that people who support a local faith community, that's probably their number one, church, synagogue, etc. And education tends to be number two. That's just kind of statistically how it plays out. So if you're not in one of those categories, expecting a board member to have you in their top 3, 4, 5 is probably reasonable. If you're not in their top 5, I would just question whether the board is the right seat for them. You need board members who believe strongly in you and that aren't sitting on 6 other boards. That would be my counsel. So just understanding their philanthropic priorities and whether your board is really where they give their best energy and attention and philanthropy is an important question to ask. They should be willing to introduce people. This doesn't mean that they have to ask for money. It's not a hard sell, but if they believe in your mission, it stands to reason that they would ask others to join in your mission. So whether that's introducing people at an event or sending an email or introducing to your staff, coming in for a tour, if they're passionate about your mission, this should be a no-brainer. So typically we don't see this as a big problem unless the board member is not really bought in to the organization. Otherwise, introducing friends shouldn't be a tough thing to do. And then just participating as impassioned volunteers, whatever that means for your organization. So whatever events you might expect people to come to, or even rolling up their sleeves as a volunteer in different ways. Again, we should expect our boards to be good volunteers and good donors. And that can take a lot of different forms and a lot of different levels. So that's got to be very organization specific, but defining that for your board is really important. So how do you do that? How do you engage a board that may be lacking in some of those areas? Well, number one is you can get them some training, and that can be free, that can be paid for. There's lots of ways to do that. It could be reading a book. There's lots of good books out there that we sometimes recommend that the board reads collectively and then use it as a discussion among the board to just talk about expectations. You know, there's no such thing as board training that everybody sort of gets and understands. So board members typically come to your board only with the experience they've had or not had on other boards. And they bring that with them. And sometimes your expectations are very different than what they've had other places. So it's reasonable, even if for very savvy board members, to get some training around the expectations of this board and how this board is going to function. You may need to reset expectations. We see this a lot with boards that may be struggling on how to change the culture within the expectations of the board. And sometimes it's just as simple as saying, we need to have a governance committee that's going to review our processes, our job descriptions, our bylaws, all those things, and come back with recommendations on how we kind of reset expectations of board members. Many times people came in under different leaders, CEOs, for example. And so one CEO might have enlisted somebody 5, 6 years ago with a very different expectation than your current CEO. So it's fair that the board would all be kind of, working from the same playbook. And sometimes we just have to reset job descriptions, expectations, and kind of rally the board around redefining that. Building an effective development committee. If you don't have a development committee today on your board, this is a great way to engage a handful of people in really owning and helping execute the fundraising strategy. It doesn't mean they plan your events. It doesn't mean that they run the development shop, but it can mean that they are people who really walk alongside your development director or team or CEO in introducing networks and kind of walking out some of the more relational donor work. It's a great use of a handful of board members to kind of do in a committee setting. And then involving the board in strategic development planning. We're not addressing that format today, but all the things we're talking about really do play into creating a strategic development plan. And engaging the board at some level in owning that strategy is a great way to engage them. It's not just, hey, we need to raise $2 million next year, but this is the strategy we're going to use. This is why we do events. This is our goal with our events, is to find new people and meet with them and, take them deeper into relationship. Engaging your board in that conversation is a great way for them to have more buy-in into how the organization raises money. Okay, fourth is realistic financial benchmarks. Oftentimes we see that this is a reason for staff turnover in development, because the benchmarks or the expectations are just not realistic for a development team. So what should you measure? In our view, there's 3 metrics that are the foundation of development. Anything else you measure is maybe great, but these are the 3 that we always start with. And they are retention, number 1, growth, and then new donors. So why retention? First of all, back to the kind of for-profit analogy earlier about who is your customer. The other for-profit analogy is that your best customer is your current customer. And that applies 100% in philanthropy. Donors are very prone to give to organizations multiple times if they feel valued, if they feel that their money is being used wisely, and if they really believe in the mission and the impact that they can make. So retention is a reflection of honesty, integrity, and trust from the organization to the donor, and simply a fulfillment of their expectations, which might be very small. It might just be, well thought out processes and acknowledgements and thank yous or phone calls, just simple ways that a donor knows that you've received their gift, that you've utilized their gift, and that you're appreciative of their gift. For large donors, the expectations may be higher, and there may be a lot more work to do to meet those expectations. But when we see a low retention rate in an organization, this is ultimately what we know is happening at some level, and that there's problems to be fixed there. So we always start with retention as the number 1 metric that we track. Second is growth, as I mentioned, and that's just, if you've got donors giving you $500 a year today, is there a way to ask them for $1,000 or $2,000 and apply any number that you like? But most organizations have a lot of untapped potential in their existing donor base. And so spending time there, building those relationships, taking them deeper, retaining donors and growing donors will bear a lot more fruit more quickly than just new donors. So we put new donors third because we want to first focus on how we can retain, where we can grow. Once we have a handle on those metrics, then we say, what do we need to do in terms of acquisition of new donors? And how much time and energy should we spend on that versus the retention and growth of our current donor base? So those are the 3 simple metrics that we recommend are part of a healthy development operation. Okay, the last factor here is then execution of that relationship-based model. So if you think about the pyramid again, and the bottom of the pyramid, where we've got a lot of names and people who come to us through different campaigns and events and things, execution then of identifying those people and beginning to engage in relationship-based strategies is the most important work for a development team to do. So a simple way to think about this is what we think about as a decision spectrum that we move donors through from a transactional relationship to a relational relationship, and ultimately what we think of as a transformational relationship. So on the transactional side, we're talking about simple responses that people can do very quickly without a lot of thought, without even a relationship. So that could be buying an event ticket, even responding to an online appeal of some kind, buying an auction item. Those are all fun and good ways to get to know people, but they're transactional. What we want to do is move donors then to relational strategy, which simply means they're now interacting with a person around their giving and not online or through other mechanisms. So relational now means that as a donor, I can pick up the phone and call somebody that I know in the development office, maybe the CEO or board member, somebody I'm attached to. And I talk to them about my giving, and they know when I'm sending in a check, and they talk to me about what's happening and invite me to things and engage me in deeper ways. That's the ultimate kind of transition we want to make. With some donors, then we're going to have the opportunity to do transformational work, which may be things like capital campaigns, endowment gifts, legacy planning. And that's when people are doing extraordinary things, which typically comes from a relational experience with an organization and with its leaders. So that's the spectrum we're trying to take people down. So why should we do that? I'm using the term major gifts here, which I don't really love, but because we use it so much in our industry, I think everybody will know what I mean. But when I think about major gifts, it's really just that relational kind of approach, which typically results in larger gifts. But it really is this kind of idea of just the relationship. So why should we ask? Why should we take people down this journey? So, just a few thoughts here, but we don't hesitate to ask for other things. For some reason, we just kind of, as a society, have this kind of weird thing about money. You need money. You have specific financial needs that you have to meet in your organization every year. This is a proactive way to share with donors what you need as an organization and to tie their interests to what you're doing. So it's not intended to be transactional at all. It's intended to be highly interactive and relational, and a way for you to communicate with a donor that this is what's happening in the organization. These are the things we're doing. These are the ways that you can support us. And whether they decide to give to you through an event sponsorship or not, it's their decision, but you're at least presenting them with other ways that they can support you. And many donors love this approach. They love to know that they're making significant impact outside of events and campaigns and things like that. It also gives you more control over your destiny. You're not sitting back, hoping that that campaign exceeds goal or that your auction raises twice as much as it did last year. You're actually proactively sharing with donors the things that you need and the types of gifts that you're looking for, and allowing them to respond to that. So at the bottom line of all of this is, if you believe your mission is urgent, and I know you do, it requires a proactive approach. And if we sit back behind a desk and just hope that people respond to our messages, we're going to continually be frustrated and probably stagnant. So this is a way to experience growth and to experience sustainability, because these kinds of relationships are the ones that tend to be donors that stick with you for a very long time. So why would you ask for something specific? Sometimes we get some pushback on this from nonprofit leaders. They feel uncomfortable asking for a specific gift. So just a few thoughts around this. We kind of laugh and say, well, you kind of need specific gifts. You have specific things that you need to do, and there's always a monetary attachment to that. So talking about your budget in specific terms should not be difficult to do, and donors appreciate it. The second one is really my favorite, because this is what I've experienced, is that it gives the donor something very, a clear plan or specific to consider. So if I say to a donor, we would love for you to make a meaningful gift, and I leave it open-ended like that, I have no idea what meaningful means to that person. And what it means to me is probably different. So instead of just using these nebulous words, getting specific gives donors something to respond to. Savvy donors expect this. So if you're talking to donors that are philanthropic in other places and have given larger gifts to other places, they're probably used to a request that's very specific. and it gives them something to react to. It doesn't mean that they're going to do exactly what you ask. And in my experience, there's almost never a negative reaction to this, or you're asking for too much or not enough. But they appreciate that you've given them something specific in a form of a proposal or some other request, and they can think about it, and now they've got something to react to. And we just like to say hope is not a strategy. So again, sitting back and just kind of hoping that people do what we think they should do is a pretty risky way to plan your development operation. So then why should you ask someone you know? We get this question a lot from board members who may be uncomfortable with solicitation. So just a few thoughts around that. We go back to the board conversation in particular. If I'm a board member that is truly bought into this mission, it shouldn't be a stretch for me to introduce others. If I say this mission enriches my life or has enriched my family's life or somebody I know, I believe in it for a reason, it stands to reason that it might enrich the lives of others in a similar way. In the same way that we would share recommendations of our favorite restaurants or books or movies or other things that we love, why not say that, hey, this is an organization that I support and this is why, and I would love for you to learn more about it. That's what we're really asking people to do. They don't have to be trained in solicitation to have that kind of a conversation. And so the goal here is just within our own networks personally, that we would encourage board, staff, and anybody to say, we'd love for you to talk to those you know about your experience here and introduce them to the organization. Okay, so getting close to wrapping up here, but you have a finite amount of time and all nonprofit staff members are stretched. So as you think about where to spend your time and energy, should you spend it with the 5 nicest people that you could hang out with, or the 5 who could fund your entire mission? So obviously the answer is the latter, but many times we see that nonprofit leaders feel stretched to do this work and they're not sure where to start. So it stands to reason that if your job is to fund your mission, you need to be spending time with people who can help you do that. It doesn't mean some people are more important than others in life. It just means when the context of this work and achieving this objective, that we need to be spending time with people who can actually have a significant impact on the financial outcomes. So a visual of this, if you think about that pyramid again in this format, you know, the most organizations tend to spend a lot of time at the bottom and middle of their pyramids. They spend a lot of time planning campaigns, giving days, events, online appeals, direct mail, and those are all worthy strategies, but they do that too many times at the expense of not spending time with the people in your donor base who could really make a significant impact. So this is where just kind of that alignment and thinking about where time and energy should go is a really good internal conversation. If you're really focused on retention of your existing donor base, that takes time and effort. And so as a development professional, I always say, you know, if you're spending more time behind a desk, you know, looking at emails and proofing documents and writing copy for campaigns, and you say, I don't have time for my donors, you need to flip that script. There's so much more value and return in spending time with 3 or 4 donors a week, if you can, or more, than sitting behind a desk. So that's where we want to see our best time and energy going. So just to kind of restate this, the greatest potential for growth in any development operation is going to be in the existing donor base. The only exception to this is if you're a startup. If you're a startup, you're in a different stage of business. But for those of you with an existing donor base, this is where your greatest potential lies. People who said yes to you once are much more likely to say yes to you again, as opposed to acquiring people who don't know you today. So this is where your best time and energy can be spent. So to kind of wrap this up, the mantra here is going deeper with fewer. So how do you do this? You identify a manageable group, and that's a number that you're going to have to determine based on staffing and capacity and all those things. But you determine a manageable group that you believe either must be retained or could be grown, ideally, that have capacity, and you learn about them. You spend time with them, ask them why they support you, what else do they do philanthropically, understand what kind of makes them tick, show them how their giving has been utilized previously, give them some examples. If they've given you $5,000, what does $5,000 do in the context of your mission? How can you make that tangible for them? And then ask, at some point, not maybe the first conversation, but over the journey of this relational work, at some point, this is a very effective strategy. Can I bring you a proposal? Would you be open to me actually showing you a specific way that you could support us? And then propose specific things. If you serve in a homeless mission and you say, our food program costs this much a year, is that a program that you'd be willing to support at this level? Now you've given them something very specific that hopefully speaks to their interests and their passions and gets them really excited about investing in you. So again, what are they interested in? How can you make that tangible for them, make it relational and something that's very impactful? So in short, the moral of the story here is that you make it about the donor, and learning about the donor in the relational process ultimately should yield not just larger investments from the donor, but more impactful and exciting investments for them, because now you've connected what they really care about with something very specific in your mission. And maybe you've taken a donor that started buying auction items at an event and really transformed that into a different type of relationship. So what should we be doing? If you think about how to take this back and make it tangible, here are some things that we would recommend. So first of all, take a look at your events. This is a wonderful time to do this. If you're back in event planning mode, to rethink why you do events. Are they healthy? Are they achieving what you want them to do? This is a great exercise to do in a small group with staff or board. Really think about your story and your case. Are you telling your story in a compelling way? Do donors really understand the impact that you make and how their gifts move you forward in that impact? Can you develop those fundable projects from the budget? The food example I gave a second ago is just one. There's many, many ways to develop things from your budget that make a donor's giving more tangible to them. How many people can you serve with a gift of a certain size? What specific things do you need that a donor could sort of attach their gift to, perhaps, that would make it more tangible? Focus on fewer, identify those manageable groups or segments. And I would say if you feel overwhelmed, start with 10. That's kind of my baseline number that I tell even a single shingle kind of executive director that's a one-person shop. If you can't do anything else day to day in fundraising, know your top 10 donors and get to know them better and understand what makes them tick. And if you retain just those top 10 as a starting point, that's the best place to start. Engage your board, have this conversation at the board level, figure out where board members can plug in. Do they understand the expectations? Are they donors? Are they impassioned volunteers? How can they come alongside you? And then last, get out of the office. Thankfully, we can do that. Hopefully, everybody's doing that more today, and this summer will just get better. But sitting behind a desk is not the most effective way to build relationships and raise money. So if you're not getting out of the office, if your development team is not getting out of the office on a regular basis, you need to probably be asking why and figuring out how to flip perhaps where some of that time and energy is going. Okay, so that wraps the presentation today. As Lacey said, those questions, I know some of you have been submitting questions as we've been going. You're going to get a recording of the slides, And if you're interested in doing a deeper conversation with us, you can go to our website and sign up for a 30-minute consultation with one of our team members, and we'd be happy to go a little deeper into one of these topics. So Lacey, if you want to give me a question.
Hello. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I will let you know that there have been a couple of different just comments in the question box saying, thanks so much. Great presentation. I agree. Not exactly what they were agreeing to, which part, but a lot of thumbs ups, which is fantastic. So the first question that a couple of people asked in very similar ways is around board giving, and really kind of how to get board members to embrace giving, to kind of find out what is that, what can they do to get past that uncomfortability when it comes to it, for also board members who might be parents or civil servants,
Right.
that maybe don't have as much capacity.
Right. Yeah, great question. I knew I'd probably strike a chord with that comment. So look, here's the simple way that I look at this. Again, leadership by example. So if I'm going to serve on a board, whether I have capacity to make a $15 gift or a $50,000 gift, the part of my commitment as a board member is that I contribute to this organization in the same way that I expect others to do so. And yes, you know, there's time, talent, but I'm a big believer in time, talent, treasure. And that treasure doesn't have to be equal across the board. This is why we are not fans of a board giving number, because it's very difficult for that to make sense for the entire board. To, you know, like Lacey said, we work with a lot of organizations that have civil servants and people on their board representing certain entities in the community. Their threshold is going to look very different from a community volunteer or a CEO who may have significant capacity. So saying we want all board members to give $1,000 is going to be a stretch for some, and it's going to be a very low number for others. And it starts to feel like dues. That's what I don't like about that strategy. So the way that I like to frame this with a board is when we enlist a board member, we would like to be in your top 5, top 3, whatever the number is for you, philanthropic priorities, whatever that means to you. So as a board member, I can take that and say, is this organization in my top 5 of where I give my dollars every year? And if it is, then I can answer that with integrity and know that that's an expectation as a board member, is that I'm going to be asked to make a gift that's meaningful to me on an annual basis. The other way that I sometimes phrase this is, what does meaningful mean? It means that it's a gift that I probably talk about with my spouse or others in my life with whom I make financial decisions. So it's not a gift of convenience and, oh, this is my dues check for this organization, but it's something that in my case, you know, my husband and I would sit down and talk about every year. That's how we would frame, you know, a meaningful gift to this organization, regardless of size.
Yeah, that's great. So here's one kind of, you spoke about this in the beginning of the webinar about strategic development planning and what metrics can really be set within that so that people don't just spend time on, here are our KPIs, here's what we're doing, but actually showing here's the value add.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to retention and growth. Those are the metrics that we focus on in strategic development planning. You know, I would encourage whoever asked that question, I would encourage you to go look at our strategic development planning webinar, because we've got a lot of content on this that goes into more detail. But essentially what we're trying to do is shift from an event or an activity-based growth model. In other words, this campaign raised 50,000 last year, let's try for 60 next year. And instead we want to make it a donor-centric experience. So if you look at your top 100 donors, sources, individuals, corporations, whatever, and look at that group of donors compared to your entire fundraising budget, it's probably more than 50%, probably. Most organizations would experience that. So the lesson from that in terms of projecting growth becomes, are we tracking what donors are doing year over year not just what piece of the budget that falls into. So if a donor is giving me $10,000 a year, and one year it goes to an event sponsorship, and the next year it goes to my annual fund, and the next year it goes somewhere else, I don't really care where it goes in my budget. I want to know that that donor is continuing to give, or that we could look for an opportunity to maybe increase that donor's gift through a more specific ask or approach. So the retention and growth are the primary metrics in a strategic development plan, but we do it very much based on segmenting your donor base, not just looking at activities and how each activity grows.
Yeah, that's great. So I have two that I'm kind of combining here, very similar questions about need-based asks, when maybe sometimes people want to focus more on, oh, well, here's what the classroom costs are or this, but how do you make that shift to go into more of a need-based ask?
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure I'm answering the right question. Needs of the organization. Is that what we're
This
talking
was saying
about?
Taking budget items and turning them into.
Okay. Yeah. Kind of it's that fundable project concept. So I'm wondering if this is coming from a school, just because the way you phrased that.
The first part was coming from a school.
Okay. So I'm going to utilize that because schools have some unique qualities. So if you're in an organization that has significant sources of earned revenue. So in a school, you have tuition. And that's why this is, I think, unique, is it's sometimes hard to make the case for why parents or people should give in addition to paying to it. Why doesn't tuition cover everything? That's a common question. So the exercise that we would encourage you to do as an organization is to really look at your budget from the perspective of, what does philanthropy allow us to do? So if we did allow tuition to cover everything, there would be some things in your budget you wouldn't do. We've called this in the past the red pen exercise, where we literally challenge a board or a leader to look at your budget and say, okay, if you raise $500,000 a year in philanthropy at your school, what would you cut if that philanthropy wasn't there next year? What are the programs, salaries, whatever those extracurriculars, that then can become sort of the foundation of your annual appeal, or at least how you frame those fundable projects or needs to a donor. So yes, tuition, covers the basics, but a lot of schools, as an example, will, we have one school client that calls their annual fund their margin of excellence. And the message is, yes, tuition allows us to do most of what we need to do, but if we're going to be excellent in these areas, we have to have a philanthropic component to our revenue model that allows us to do these things. So it could be extracurriculars, it could be, scholarships, of course. You could begin to talk about, the lab needs and the science labs and the music and art and sports and all those things that everybody wants, but that, really is funded through philanthropy.
Yeah, great. So that we'll have time for just one more quick question. And then this kind of ties into how we're going to wrap this up today, of kind of wrapping up our leadership webinar series in April. But what recommendations, Jennifer, can you give for, you mentioned some books or other trainings for boards in the interim?
Yeah, well, there's 3 on my screen. Just kidding. No, we do have 3 books that are available. The Perfect Development Office is really about just growing a development operational fund on a lot of levels. The Perfect Campaign is about that extraordinary funding model and what that looks like. And Raising to the Challenge is a book that's actually told in a fable format and would be applicable, especially to the schools listening, because there's a lot of stuff in there about how schools do the philanthropy thing with tuition. Another book that I recommend is called The Nonprofit Secret by a guy named Jonathan Schick, who's another Dallas-based guy. It's a really good read for boards, and one that we've recommended before that boards read as a group and then discuss, because it kind of is a nice high-level conversation around board expectations. That's the specific one that comes to mind right now. There's some good free sources out there on board training. Board Source is a great resource. We certainly can do board training either virtually or in person around specific topics. But those are a few resources I'd think about.
Yeah, well, great. And so, like I said, we're wrapping up our leadership webinar series in April with our Forming an Effective Development Committee webinar. So I invite you all to join that as well. That's going to be on April 20th at noon. But also know that after you get the copy of this recording, to go back and look at our other series from this leadership series. And then all of our webinars from previous topics are in our webinar library, and that's on our resource page of our website. And there's other free resources there that you guys can go to and share with your boards, share with leadership of your organization. So we want to encourage you to do that. Well, we thank you so much. Jennifer, any parting words before we go?
No, happy spring. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll look forward to seeing you in April.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.